There has never been a city quite like Babylon. Not in size, not in ambition, not in the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing you are the center of everything and that history itself bends toward you. The walls alone were enough to make a grown man stop walking and just stare. Ancient writers described them as wide enough at the top for two chariots to pass each other going in opposite directions. The Ishtar Gate, covered in glazed blue brick and decorated with dragons and bulls in gold, stood at the northern entrance to the city like a declaration. Not a gate, a statement that said everything important happens here. And everyone who matters eventually comes through this door. The Euphrates River ran directly through the center of the city, divided by bridges, lined with temples and markets and administrative buildings that stretched further than a person could walk in a single day. The population numbered in the hundreds of thousands at its peak, drawn from every corner of the ancient world, speaking dozens of languages, trading in every commodity the earth produced. And above all of it, physically and symbolically, stood the ziggurat, the great temple tower, the structure that later generations would call the Tower of Babel. It rose in stages toward the sky, each level smaller than the one below, until at the top there was a shrine. The Babylonians called it Etemenanki, the house where heaven and earth meet. That name tells you everything you need to know about how Babylon understood itself. Heaven and earth did not meet in Jerusalem. Heaven and earth did not meet in Egypt or Assyria or anywhere else. Heaven and earth met in Babylon, which meant that if you wanted access to the divine, if you wanted to be part of the story that mattered, if you wanted your life to count for something in the great ledger of history, you needed to be in Babylon. You needed to speak Babylonian. You needed to eat Babylonian food, study Babylonian texts, worship Babylonian gods, and eventually think Babylonian thoughts. This was not just a military empire. Every military empire in history has eventually crumbled under the weight of its own armies. Babylon was something more dangerous than that. Babylon was a system, a complete and total system designed to take whatever came into it and reshape it in its own image. It took your children and made them scholars. It took your gods and put them in its temples. It took your history and rewrote it as a prelude to Babylonian greatness. It took your name and gave you a better one, a Babylonian one that fit the sound of the language and the structure of the culture and the theology of the gods. Babylon did not conquer you and then ignore you. Babylon conquered you and then invited you to become Babylonian. And the invitation came with enough comfort and prestige and opportunity that many people accepted it gratefully and never looked back. This is what made Babylon so hard to resist. Not the walls, not the armies, not the kings with their absolute power and their absolute willingness to use it. What made Babylon hard to resist was that it offered something genuinely attractive. It offered belonging. It offered meaning. It offered a place in the greatest story being told in the ancient world. All it asked in return was everything. What happens when a city that owns the world tries to own a person who belongs to something else? That is the question this story is going to answer. And the answer begins with a boy being carried through the Ishtar Gate with a new name already waiting for him on the other side. Chapter 1. Jerusalem falls, and a boy is chosen. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That sentence, the first sentence of the book of Daniel, contains an entire world ending in 11 words. To understand what those 11 words meant to the people who lived through them, you have to understand what Jerusalem was. Not just politically, not just militarily. Jerusalem was the place where the God of Israel had chosen to put his name. The temple that Solomon had built there was not simply a religious building. It was the place where heaven touched earth. It was the Israelite version of Etemenanki, the house where the divine and the human met. When the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the inner sanctuary, when the cloud of presence filled the building so completely that the priests could not stand to perform their duties. Something real had happened there. Something that the people of Israel had organized their entire understanding of history and identity and hope around. And now the army of Babylon was outside the walls. The year was 605 before the Common Era. Nebuchadnezzar had just returned from one of the decisive military engagements of the ancient world, Teleday, the Battle of Carchemish, where he had shattered the Egyptian army and established Babylonian dominance over the entire Fertile Crescent. He was not yet formally king when he marched on Jerusalem. His father Nabopolassar was still on the throne in Babylon. But when news came that Nabopolassar had died, Nebuchadnezzar turned the army around and headed home, pausing just long enough at Jerusalem to do something more calculated than conquest. He did not destroy the city. Not yet. Not this time. That would come later. In waves. Each one more devastating than the last. Until finally in 587 before the Common Era, there would be nothing left of the temple but rubble and ash. What Nebuchadnezzar did in 605 was more strategic than destruction. He took people, specifically, he took young men from the royal family and the nobility of Israel, young men who were without blemish, good-looking, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. The language of the selection process sounds almost like a college admissions criteria, and in a way that is exactly what it was. Nebuchadnezzar was not building a slave workforce. He had plenty of those. He was building something more useful, a class of educated, capable, culturally assimilated administrators who could serve as a bridge between Babylon and the peoples Babylon had conquered. Take the best of your enemy's next generation. Bring them to your capital. Teach them your language, your literature, your science, your theology. Feed them from your own table. Give them Babylonian names and Babylonian careers. And in 3 years, you will not have prisoners. You will have Babylonians. It was, by any objective measure, a brilliant strategy. And it worked. For most of the young men who went through it, it worked exactly as designed. Among those taken from Jerusalem were 4 young men whose names the text records with care: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. We do not know exactly how old they were. The text describes them as youths, and the Hebrew word suggests adolescence, probably somewhere between 14 and 17, old enough to be educated, young enough to be reshaped. Think about what that moment looked like from the inside. You are 15 years old. You have grown up in Jerusalem, in a family connected enough to the palace that you know the names of the priests and the sons of nobles eat together, and you have probably seen the temple up close, maybe even been brought inside the outer courts on feast days. Your whole world has a shape, and that shape is organized around a city, a temple, a people, and a God who chose all 3. And then the army comes, and then someone with a list writes your name down, and then you are walking north, away from Jerusalem, away from everything that gave your world its shape, toward a city so large and so foreign that you cannot even fully imagine it yet. You have heard stories. Travelers have come through Jerusalem with accounts of the walls, the gates, the towers, the gardens. But stories are not the same as standing at the edge of a place and understanding that you are now inside it, and the gate has closed behind you, and the only way forward is through. What does a 15-year-old boy do with that? What does he do with the fear that will not let him sleep on the road north? What does he do with the grief of a mother's face he keeps seeing when he closes his eyes? What does he do with the theological crisis that is sitting in the center of his chest like a stone? The question that every Israelite exile had to face, and that had no comfortable answer if God lives in Jerusalem. If God chose Jerusalem. If the temple in Jerusalem is the place where heaven and earth meet, Then what does it mean that God allowed this to happen? Where is God now? That question is not asked explicitly in the first chapter of Daniel, but it is underneath every sentence. It is the ground the whole story is built on, and the way Daniel and his three friends answer it, not in a single dramatic declaration, but through 1,000 small decisions made across the length of their lives, is what this story is about. They arrived in Babylon. The Ishtar Gate was exactly as large as the stories said it was, and the system was already waiting for them. The king appointed for them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they were to stand before the king. The resources were generous. The opportunity was real. Nebuchadnezzar was not offering them a prison. He was offering them a future. All it required was that they become someone else. The first sign that something in these 4 young men was not going to follow the expected path came almost immediately. And it came in a form so quiet and so specific that it is easy to underestimate it. They would not eat the king's food. But before we get to that, we need to talk about what happened to their names. Because the food refusal is a tactic, the naming is something deeper. The naming is where you find out what Babylon actually wanted from them, and what they were actually defending. Chapter 2. The renaming. On the first day, or close to it, the official in charge of the young men from Judah gave them new names. Daniel became Belteshazzar. Hananiah became Shadrach. Mishael became Meshach. Azariah became Abednego. This is recorded in the text without drama, almost in passing, as if it were a routine administrative procedure, which, from Babylon's perspective, it was. You came in with a foreign name. You left with a Babylonian name. The system had been doing this for years. It worked on everyone, but names in the ancient world were not labels the way we sometimes treat them today. A name was not a sound used to get someone's attention across the room. A name was an identity. A name was a declaration about who you were, where you came from, and who you belonged to. Look at what the Hebrew names contained. Daniel meant, God is my judge. The name held inside it the Hebrew word for God, El, and a declaration about that God's authority over Daniel's life. His name was a theological statement he carried everywhere he went. Hananiah meant God has been gracious. Again, the name of God. This time, Yahweh compressed into the ending, Yah, paired with a confession about what that God had done. Mishael meant, who is what God is? A rhetorical question embedded in a name. A daily reminder that nothing and no one compares to the God of Israel. Azariah meant God has helped. The same divine name. The same confessional structure. 4 names. 4 young men. And in each name, a different facet of the same theological conviction that there is a God. That this God is specific and personal and active. And that these 4 lives belong to Him. Now look at what Babylon replaced them with. Belteshazzar referenced Bel, one of the chief Babylonian deities. Shadrach referenced Aku, the moon god. Abednego meant servant of Nebo, one of the most important gods in the Babylonian pantheon. Babylon did not just change what people called these 4 young men. Babylon tried to change whose names they carried. It tried to replace the name of their god with the names of its gods. It tried to inscribe a different theology onto their identities before they had been in the city long enough to push back. This was not accidental. The people who designed this system understood what they were doing. If you can get a person to answer to a new name long enough, eventually the new name starts to feel like the real one. Eventually the old name starts to feel like something that belonged to someone else. And when the name of your God becomes something you no longer carry with you everywhere you go, something important about who you are has been quietly rerouted. What is remarkable, and what most people miss when they read this passage quickly, is what the text does in response to this renaming. It keeps calling him Daniel, not Belteshazzar. Not the Babylonian name that the official wrote in the ledger and that the teachers used in the classroom and that the court would use for the next 7 decades. The text, in chapter after chapter, year after year, uses Daniel, the Hebrew name, the one that says, God is my judge. That is a choice. Somebody wrote this text, and somebody made that choice. And it is not an accident. The narrator is telling you something. The narrator is telling you that whatever Babylon called him, whatever name appeared on the official documents of the most powerful empire in the world, the name that was actually true was still Daniel. The empire can rename you. The empire can write a different name on the official ledger and enforce that name in every official context and surround you with people who have never heard you called anything else. But there is something in a person that can refuse the renaming at the level that actually matters. Not loudly, not with protests or proclamations, just by continuing to be. In the interior place where identity actually lives, the person whose name the empire could not reach. For anyone who has ever had a system try to define them differently than they define themselves, this is a recognizable experience. The immigrant whose name gets shortened or Americanized until the original feels like a foreign language. The person whose professional identity slowly swallows the identity they came in with. The student who enters an institution with one set of convictions and is slowly, through accumulated pressure and social reward, shaped into someone who holds a different set. Babylon is very good at renaming. It has been doing it for a long time. What Daniel's story asks, from the very first pages, is whether there is something in you that remains legible under the new name, whether the person who came through the gate is still present after the gate has closed. For Daniel and his 3 friends, the answer turned out to be yes. But that answer was not given once and then settled forever. It was given again and again, in different rooms, under different pressures, at different ages, across the entire length of their lives. The renaming was just the beginning, and the first real test came before the first year was out. In a room that smelled like food from the king's table, there are moments when the largest questions get asked in the smallest settings. A room, a meal, a young man deciding what he will and will not put in his mouth. That is where Daniel drew his first line in Babylon. And the way he drew it tells you almost everything about how he would draw every line that followed. He did not make a scene. He did not stand up in the dining hall and deliver a speech about the God of Israel and the corruption of Babylonian food and the theological implications of eating meat sacrificed to foreign gods. He went quietly to the official in charge of him and made a request. He asked for a test. Give us vegetables and water for 10 days. He said, then compare us to the young men who have been eating the king's food and make your decision based on what you see. That is not the request of someone who does not understand the system he is operating in. That is the request of someone who understands it very well and has found a way to hold his ground within it without forcing a confrontation that would benefit no one. The official agreed. 10 days later, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than all the young men who had been eating the king's food. The system that was designed to produce Babylonians had produced something it did not expect. 4 people who could operate at the highest level of Babylonian society while remaining in the place that actually mattered, entirely themselves. The new name was written in the ledger, but in the text, and in the man himself, Daniel remained Daniel. Chapter 3. The food refusal and what it actually meant. There is a version of the food refusal story that gets told in children's Sunday school classes all over America. And it goes something like this. Daniel was a good boy who followed the rules of his religion. God blessed him for it. And the lesson is that you should always obey God even when it is hard. That version is not wrong exactly, but it misses the thing that makes this moment genuinely interesting. The food refusal was not primarily about dietary law. It was about something much larger. And understanding what it was actually about changes how you read everything that follows. Start with what the king's food actually was. In the ancient Near East, The food served at a royal table did not simply appear. It went through a process. Before it was eaten by human beings, portions of it were presented to the gods of the kingdom as an offering. The meat was dedicated. The wine was poured out. The bread was consecrated. When you sat down at the king's table and ate what was placed in front of you, you were not just eating a meal. You were participating in an act of worship directed toward the gods that the king served and that the empire acknowledged as real. This is why the food mattered. Eating it was not a neutral act. It was a statement. It said, I recognize these gods. I participate in this system of worship. I am, in this specific and concrete way, part of Babylon, and Daniel could not make that statement, not because he was rigidly following a checklist of religious rules, but because making that statement would have been a lie. He did not belong to Babylon's gods. He belonged to someone else. And eating from a table consecrated to gods he did not worship would have been a form of saying otherwise. A quiet, private, daily form of saying otherwise, but a form of it nonetheless. So he drew a line, but here is what matters most about how he drew it. He did not draw it loudly. He went privately to Ashpenaz, the official in charge of him, and he made a request. The text says he asked for permission not to defile himself. He framed it as a personal matter, not a political one. He was not trying to start a movement. He was trying to find a way to remain faithful in a space that was not designed to accommodate his faithfulness. And then he offered a deal. Give us 10 days on vegetables and water. He said, then look at us and look at the young men who ate the king's food and make your decision based on what you observe. That offer reveals something important about Daniel's intelligence, and not just the academic kind. He understood the situation Ashpenaz was in. He understood that the official was not his enemy, but also was not free to simply grant whatever Daniel wanted. Ashpenaz was afraid. The text tells us this directly. He was afraid that Daniel and his friends would end up looking worse than the other young men, and that he would be held responsible for the consequences. His head was on the line as surely as theirs was, so Daniel gave him a way out. He gave him a test with a measurable outcome. He gave him cover. If it works, Ashpenaz can say he ran an experiment and the results spoke for themselves. If it does not work, they go back to the king's food and no one has to know there was ever a conversation about it. This is wisdom applied to the specific constraints of a specific situation. Daniel was not looking for the most dramatic way to be faithful. He was looking for a way to actually be faithful in the environment he was actually in. And that required understanding the environment well enough to find a path through it that worked. The 10 days passed. Daniel and his 3 friends looked better than all the young men who had eaten the royal food. Ashpenaz agreed to the arrangement going forward. There is a pattern here that shows up over and over again in Daniel's story. And it is worth naming it now so we can recognize it later. Daniel almost never sought conflict for its own sake. He did not go looking for lines to draw or battles to pick. He served faithfully and competently inside the system. He did his work. He answered questions. He gave counsel. He administered. He functioned, by every external measure, as a model Babylonian official. But there were specific backings he would not do. Specific lines that, when he reached them, he did not cross. And those lines were not arbitrary. They were about worship. They were about the question of whose he was at the level that could not be negotiated. That distinction is crucial. Daniel was not trying to keep Babylon out of his life. He was not living in some kind of cultural isolation, surrounding himself only with other Israelites, refusing to learn the language or engage the literature or participate in the society. He learned the language. He engaged the literature. He participated in the society at the highest possible level. He became genuinely excellent at doing Babylonian things. What he would not do was worship Babylonian gods. That was the line. And when he drew it in the quietest, most strategic, least inflammatory way he could find. Because the point was not to make a statement. The point was to remain faithful. The distinction between those two things matters more than most people think. Making a statement is for the audience. It is about being seen to stand. Remaining faithful is between you and the one you are faithful to. It is about actually standing, regardless of who is watching. But we should not make this too clean. We should not pretend that what Daniel did here was easy, or that his internal experience of it was uncomplicated. He was a teenager in a city that was not his. The food on the table smelled good. The other young men around him were eating it without apparent conflict. The path of least resistance was right in front of him, and it was an attractive path. Because it did not just mean a good meal. It meant belonging. It meant fitting in. It meant one less way of being different in a place where being different already had costs. The loneliness of being the person who does not eat what everyone else is eating is not a small thing. It is a daily reminder that you are not fully inside the thing everyone else is inside. And Babylon was very good at making you want to be fully inside. That was its whole genius. What Daniel was resisting was not just a plate of food. He was resisting the accumulated pressure of a system designed to make belonging feel like the most important thing in the world. He was resisting the daily suggestion that the most sensible, the most pragmatic, the most reasonable thing to do was to simply become Babylonian. He resisted it with 10 days of vegetables and water and a quietly offered test, and at the end of those 10 days, he looked better than everyone who had not resisted at all. The text records that at the end of 3 years, when Nebuchadnezzar examined all the young men, he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the entire kingdom. The system had trained them. They had led it. They had become genuinely excellent at everything the system taught. And they had done it without the system owning the thing the system most wanted to own. That is the food refusal. Fully understood. A story about a young man who understood what was actually being asked of him and found a way to answer no to that specific thing while saying yes to everything that did not require crossing the line. He was going to have to do this again. Many times. Under much higher stakes. But the first time, in a room with a nervous official and a plate of food he would not touch. Daniel figured out something important about how to live inside Babylon without becoming Babylon. He found out it was possible. That knowledge would carry him through the decades to come. Chapter 4. The Dream No One Could Read. Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world, and he could not sleep. This is worth pausing on. The man who had shattered the Egyptian army at Carchemish. The man who had besieged Jerusalem and walked away with its best young people as trophies of his ambition. The man who was in the process of building what ancient historians would describe as one of the most magnificent cities the world had ever produced. That man was waking up in the middle of the night with something following him out of the dark. Something his mind could not hold on to and would not let go of. He had a dream. And then, in the way that dreams sometimes do, it was gone. He woke up knowing that something important had happened in the night and unable to recover exactly what it was. The images had dissolved with the darkness, leaving only the emotional residue, urgency, fear. The feeling that whatever he had seen mattered in a way he could not afford to ignore. So he did what kings do. He called his experts. He summoned the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans. These were not charlatans. These were the most educated men in the most educated city in the ancient world. Practitioners of sophisticated systems of interpretation that had been refined over centuries. If you had a dream in the ancient Near East and you wanted to know what it meant, the Chaldean experts were who you called. They were very good at their job, but Nebuchadnezzar did not ask them to interpret his dream. He asked them to tell him what the dream was. The distinction is everything. "Tell me what I dreamed," he said, "and then tell me what it means." The Chaldeans were stunned. This was not how the system worked. The dreamer told the interpreters the dream. The interpreters consulted their tables and their literature and their accumulated knowledge. And then the interpreters gave their explanation. That was the process. That was what they were trained to do. Nebuchadnezzar was asking them to do something that had no precedent, something that their entire training had not prepared them for. They told him so. No man on earth can do what the king is asking. They said, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. What the king is asking is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. And the gods do not live among men. That answer enraged Nebuchadnezzar. And what he did next reveals something about who he was underneath the imperial confidence. He ordered every wise man in Babylon to be killed. All of them. Every magician. Every enchanter. Every Chaldean interpreter. Every scholar in the capital of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Killed. Because they could not do something that no human being in the history of human beings had ever been asked to do before. The rage behind that order is not simple. It is not just the petulance of a powerful man who is not getting what he wants. There is fear underneath it. Nebuchadnezzar had built an empire on the idea that he could control everything. He had armies and administrators and resources that could bend almost any situation to his will. But the dream was doing something that armies and administrators and resources could not touch. It was sitting in his chest and refusing to be managed. And when the men who were supposed to manage it told him they could not, something in him broke open. The order went out. The soldiers found Daniel and his 3 friends and informed them that they too were to be killed. As wise men of the kingdom, Daniel asked a question that required a remarkable amount of calm in the circumstances. He asked why the decree from the king was so urgent. Not a protest, not a plea, a question. He wanted to understand what was happening before he responded to it. The commander of the guard, a man named Arioch, explained. Daniel went to the king and asked for time, promising that he would tell the king his dream and its interpretation. Then he went home, and he and his 3 friends prayed. He did not consult his notes or his training or his considerable knowledge of Babylonian interpretive systems. He went home and asked the God of heaven for mercy, for the mystery to be revealed before he and all the other wise men in Babylon were executed in the morning. During the night, the text says, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. What Daniel did next matters. Before he went to the king, before he walked into the throne room with the answer that no one else had been able to provide, he stopped and did something that might seem like a strange priority, given the urgency of the situation. He gave thanks. He blessed the God of heaven. He said, "Blessed be the name of God, forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him." He had the answer. The king was waiting. His life and the lives of every scholar in Babylon were on the line. And Daniel stopped to acknowledge where the answer had come from. That moment tells you something about Daniel's inner architecture that no resume could communicate. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar. The king asked, "Are you able to make known to me the dream and its interpretation?" Daniel said no wise man or enchanter or magician or astrologer can show the king this mystery. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He did not say, "I have figured it out." He pointed away from himself immediately and toward something else. And only then did he begin. The dream, he told Nebuchadnezzar, was a great statue. Enormous, terrifying, brilliant. Its head was fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its middle and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron. Its feet were partly iron and partly clay. And then a stone, cut not by human hands, struck the statue at its feet and shattered it. The gold and silver and bronze and iron and clay all broke into pieces together, became like chaff on a summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. and the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. Daniel told him he was the greatest king, the most powerful, the one to whom God had given dominion and power and might and glory. But after him would come another kingdom, inferior, represented by silver, and after that, another, bronze, that would rule over all the earth. And then a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, crushing and breaking everything. But that kingdom too would be divided, like the iron mixed with clay, partly strong and partly brittle, not fully holding together. And then, in the time of those kingdoms, the God of heaven would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. It would break all the other kingdoms in pieces and bring them to an end, and it would stand forever. You are the head of gold, Daniel told the most powerful man in the world, and you will not be the last chapter. Sit with the courage that took. This was not a court prophet delivering a message the king wanted to hear. This was a young man from a conquered nation telling the conqueror that his conquest had a shelf life, that the empire that felt permanent was, in the long view of heaven, just the first in a series, that the mountain was coming, and it was not made of gold. Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face before Daniel. He said, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries." He promoted Daniel to ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men. He gave honors and gifts to Daniel's 3 friends as well. The young man who had arrived in Babylon 3 years earlier with a foreign name and a refusal to eat the king's food was now running the province. And he had done it by telling the king the truth about something no king in history had wanted to hear. That power is temporary, that empires end, and that the stone which breaks them is not made by human hands. Nebuchadnezzar heard that, and for a moment, something opened in him. What he did with that opening would take years to fully work out, and the working out of it would be stranger and more painful, and ultimately more transformative than either of them could have imagined, standing in that throne room on the morning after the mystery was revealed. But that comes later. For now, there was a young exile standing where no one expected him to stand, having said what no one expected him to say, watching a king bow down in front of him, and the question hanging in the air above all of it was the question that the dream itself had raised. If empires always end, what does not end? That was the question Nebuchadnezzar could not answer yet. He would spend years finding out, and finding out would cost him everything he thought he was. Chapter 5. 3 Men and the Mathematics of the Furnace. Nebuchadnezzar built a statue. It stood 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, covered in gold, erected on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. The proportions are strange if you think about them too long. 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide is not how human bodies are shaped. This was not a realistic portrait of a king or a god. It was something else. It was a declaration made visible. It was the empire saying, in the only language large enough, this is what we are. This is who we serve. And you will acknowledge it. The decree went out to every corner of the empire. Satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. Every tier of the imperial administration, every man who held any position of authority under Nebuchadnezzar, was commanded to appear at the dedication of the image. And when the music played, every person present was to fall down and worship the golden image. The music was specific. The horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music. A full orchestra, the sound of it carrying across the plain. And the moment it began, every body on the plain of Dura was to drop to the ground. The penalty for refusal was equally specific. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Immediately. No hearing, no appeal. No opportunity to explain. The music plays. You fall down. Or you burn. This was not an accident. Nebuchadnezzar had designed a system with no ambiguity and no exit. The music was the trigger. The prostration was the response. And the furnace was the consequence of any deviation from the pattern. He had created something that was physically and psychologically almost impossible to resist. A public, visible, simultaneous act performed by thousands of people at once, with the full weight of imperial authority behind it, and death waiting for anyone who stepped out of the pattern. The music played. Every person on the plain of Dura fell down. Every person except three: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. My upright. Now stop here. Because what usually gets emphasized in this story is the supernatural element, the fourth figure in the fire, the miracle of survival. And those things matter, and we will get to them. But before we get there, we need to spend time with the human reality of what it took to stand when everyone around you was on the ground. Think about the mathematics of that moment. There were thousands of people on that plain. Government officials from every province of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Men who had navigated complex political environments, who understood survival, who had built careers on knowing when to bow and when to hold firm. Men who may have had their own private reservations about the golden statue, their own quiet doubts about whether this was the right thing to do, their own internal conversations about what God they actually served. Men who bowed anyway, because the pressure was not just the furnace. The pressure was everyone else. When the music plays and thousands of bodies drop to the ground at once and you are still standing, you are not just standing in front of Nebuchadnezzar. You are standing against the entirety of social reality as it exists in that moment. You are the only vertical thing in a horizontal world. That is a specific and enormous kind of pressure. It is the pressure not of a single threat, but of 1,000 small confirmations that what you are doing is wrong. Look around you. Everyone else has found a way. Everyone else understands the situation. Everyone else has made their peace with it. What do you know that they do not? What gives you the right to be the one who stands when the whole world bows? Those questions are not rhetorical. They are the questions that run through a person's mind in a moment like that. And if you have never been the only person standing in a room full of people who have all chosen to kneel, it is easy to underestimate how loud those questions get. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood anyway. Certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They went to the king and reminded him of his decree. They pointed out that there were 3 men who had not bowed. Men the king himself had appointed over the province of Babylon. Men who did not serve his gods and did not worship the golden image. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. But the text gives us a detail here that is easy to overlook. In his fury, he still gave them a chance. He had them brought before him, and he gave them the opportunity to bow. Right then, with the music playing again, he told them that if they worshipped, good, and if they did not, they would be thrown into the furnace. And then he said something that revealed exactly what was at the center of his anger. He said, "Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" That is the real question. Nebuchadnezzar was not primarily angry about disobedience. He was angry about a theological challenge. He was the most powerful man in the world. And 3 men from a conquered nation were standing in front of him, suggesting, by the simple act of remaining upright, that there was a God whose authority exceeded his own. That was the wound. That was what the furnace was really about. And the 3 men answered him. Their answer is one of the most remarkable speeches in the entire Hebrew Bible. They said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Read that again. Slowly. Our God is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us. But if not, we will not bow. But if not, 3 words that contain the entire weight of what faith looks like when it is not being propped up by guaranteed outcomes. 3 words that separate genuine trust from what might be called transactional religion. The version where you obey because you expect a specific return, where faithfulness is a strategy for producing a desired result. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not standing in front of Nebuchadnezzar because they had calculated that God would definitely rescue them, and therefore the risk was lower than it appeared. They were standing there because they had decided that there was something more important than survival. They had decided that the question of who they worshipped was not a question that the presence of a furnace could answer for them. They believed God could save them. They believed He might. But they also held open the possibility that He would not. And in that space, in the gap between what they hoped and what they knew for certain, they made their decision. They would not bow. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The text says the flame was so hot that the soldiers who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire were killed by the heat. The 3 men, bound, fayed fries, fell into the burning furnace. And then Nebuchadnezzar stood up. Astonished, he said, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" His counselors said yes. He said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." 4 men, unbound, walking. The text does not explain who the 4th figure was. It does not give him a name or a description beyond that single phrase. Like a son of the gods. The tradition has held multiple interpretations simultaneously for centuries. What the text does not do is resolve the question for you. It shows you the king's astonishment. It shows you the 4 figures walking in the fire. And then it shows you what happened when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out. Nebuchadnezzar called them out. They came out of the fire. And everyone who gathered around them saw that the fire had not touched their bodies. Their hair was not singed. Their clothes were not scorched. They did not even smell like smoke. They had been inside the thing that was supposed to end them and come out the other side unchanged. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and delivered His servants, who trusted in Him." Notice what he said. His servants who trusted in Him, not His servants who were certain, not His servants who had been guaranteed a rescue. His servants who trusted, the men who had said, "But if not," and meant it. The king issued a new decree. Any people or nation that spoke anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be torn limb from limb, because there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then he promoted them. This is the empire at its most confused. It has just tried to execute 3 men for refusing to worship its God, watched its own soldiers die in the attempt, witnessed something it cannot explain happening inside the furnace. And now it is promoting the survivors and issuing decrees that protect their God. Babylon does not know what to do with people who will not bow. 3 men walked out of the furnace smelling like nothing, and the empire that had tried to burn them into submission issued a decree protecting the God those 3 men had refused to stop serving. The music had played. The whole world had bowed. 3 people had stood, and what came out of the fire was not 3 charred bodies but 3 living men, and the beginning of something Nebuchadnezzar could not yet fully name. A suspicion, a crack in the foundation of everything he had built his world on. A nagging possibility that the God of the conquered might be larger than the gods of the conqueror. He would spend years working out the implications of that suspicion, and the working out would be the strangest and most painful season of his life. Chapter 6. The King Who Ate Grass. We need to talk about Nebuchadnezzar, not about what he built or what he conquered or what he destroyed. We need to talk about who he was underneath all of it, because he is the most complex figure in the first half of this story. And his arc is unlike any other king's arc in the entire Hebrew Bible. He begins the book of Daniel by sacking Jerusalem. He ends his portion of the story singing a hymn of praise to the God of Israel. Between those 2 points is a journey so strange and so specific and so human that it deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. Let us start with what the text is actually recording in Daniel chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar himself is narrating. The chapter is written in the first person, the voice of the king himself, addressed to every people and nation and language that dwells in all the earth. It reads like a royal proclamation, the kind of official document that an ancient Near Eastern king would distribute throughout his empire to mark a significant event. What Nebuchadnezzar is commemorating, in this proclamation sent to every corner of his domain, is his own humiliation. He is telling the whole world, in his own words, about the time he lost his mind. That is extraordinary. Kings do not do that. Kings commission inscriptions about their victories and their building projects and their divine favor. Kings do not draft official proclamations describing the years they spent eating grass in a field like an animal. The fact that this chapter exists in this form says something significant about what Nebuchadnezzar believed had happened to him and what he thought the whole world needed to understand about it. He had a dream, a tree, enormous, reaching to heaven, visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful and its fruit was abundant. Every creature found shelter in it. Every bird nested in its branches. It fed everyone, and then a watcher, a holy one, Asne, came down from heaven and cried aloud, "Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip its leaves and scatter its fruit. Drive away the animals and the birds, but leave the stump with its roots in the earth, bound with iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field." And then the watcher said something that shifted the image from tree to person. "Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him." Nebuchadnezzar woke up and sent for the interpreters. They could not explain it. Then he sent for Daniel. Daniel came. He listened. And the text says he was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. That detail matters. Daniel was not eager to deliver this message. He was not a prophet who relished speaking hard truth to power. He was a human being who had, by this point, spent enough time in Nebuchadnezzar's presence to have something that looked like genuine care for the man. And what Daniel was about to tell him was not something anyone would want to hear. He told him, "The tree is you." He said, "You have grown great and strong. Your greatness reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And you are going to be driven from among men. You will eat grass like an ox. You will be wet with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." But then Daniel said something that reveals the nature of the relationship he had built with this king across years of service. He said, "O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity." Perhaps. Daniel was not promising a way out. He was not offering Nebuchadnezzar a transaction, a formula by which the king could avoid what was coming. He was offering the possibility, maybe, that repentance might change something. And he was making the offer because he was sitting across from a man he had served faithfully for years, and he did not want to simply deliver the verdict and walk away. Nebuchadnezzar did not immediately change. The text gives him 12 months. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He looked out over the city he had built, the walls and the gates and the temples and the administrative buildings and the gardens, and something in him swelled to the surface. He said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" He said it while the words were still in his mouth. A voice fell from heaven. The words are exact about the timing. He was still speaking when the voice came. He did not even finish the sentence. The voice said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, To you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Immediately, the text does not describe a gradual decline. It says immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven. His hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. The most powerful man in the world was living in a field. His kingdom continued to function without him. His administrators managed the empire. The walls of Babylon still stood. The Ishtar gate was still blue and gold. From a distance, nothing appeared to have changed. But inside the palace, in the place where the king was supposed to be, there was an absence. And in a field, somewhere outside the city walls, something that had been a king was crawling through the grass. 7 periods of time passed. 7 years. Most interpreters believe 7 years of weather and exposure and the kind of profound disorientation that comes when the structures of human society that tell you who you are have been completely stripped away. Nebuchadnezzar did not have his throne to tell him he was powerful. He did not have his subjects to tell him he was great. He did not have his buildings to tell him he was permanent. He did not have his armies to tell him the world bent to his will. He had the sky and the rain and the grass and the animals, and 7 years to sit with the question of who he was, when none of the external answers were available. And at the end of those 7 years, the text says, Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes to heaven. He lifted his eyes to heaven. That is the turn. Not a dramatic moment of theological understanding. Not a vision or a miracle or a supernatural intervention. He was in a field. And he looked up, and his reason returned to him. He said, I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, What have you done? This is the man who had stood on his roof 12 months after Daniel's warning and looked at his city and said, I built this for my glory. 7 years later, he was in a field looking at the sky and saying, None can stay his hand. Something had been broken open in him. Something that the power and the wealth and the achievements and the throne and the armies had prevented from being opened. He had needed to lose all of it to discover what was underneath it. His reason and his kingdom were restored. His counselors and his lords sought him out. He was re-established over his kingdom, and still more greatness was added to him. And he wrote the proclamation and sent it to every people and nation and language in his empire. He wanted the whole world to know. Now let us ask the question this chapter demands. What does the Ark of Nebuchadnezzar tell us about anything beyond the specific circumstances of one ancient king? It tells us something about the relationship between power and blindness. Nebuchadnezzar was not a stupid man. He was brilliant in the ways that the people who rise to the top of complex systems are brilliant. He read people accurately. He made strategic decisions with long-term consequences. He understood that taking Jerusalem's best young men was more valuable than destroying Jerusalem entirely. He was thinking, but there is a specific blindness that power produces which has nothing to do with intelligence. It is the blindness that comes from being surrounded, for long enough, by evidence that you are the most important thing in your vicinity. When your word is law, and your approval is currency, and your buildings are the largest, and your armies are the most feared, it becomes genuinely difficult to maintain a clear perception of your own size relative to everything else. The feedback loop of power rewards the belief in your own centrality and punishes any serious questioning of it. Nebuchadnezzar needed to eat grass for 7 years to break that feedback loop. He needed to be in a place with no throne, and no armies, and no buildings, and no counselors who needed something from him. A place where the rain fell on him, the same way it fell on the animals. Where the sun rose and set without asking his permission. Where the world was entirely indifferent to his greatness. He needed to discover that the world continued to function without him at the center of it. Most people do not get 7 years in a field. Most people learn this lesson, if they learn it at all, in smaller and less dramatic ways, through failure, through loss, through the experience of building something and watching it fall apart, through the moment when the systems that told you who you were stop working and you have to find out who you are without them. Nebuchadnezzar learned it the hard way. And then he lifted his eyes to heaven. Daniel was somewhere in Babylon when the king came back. He had spent 7 years administering the province while Nebuchadnezzar was in the field. He had kept the machinery running, kept faith with his responsibilities, served the empire faithfully, even in the absence of the man he had warned. He did not use those 7 years to position himself. He served, and when Nebuchadnezzar came back and wrote his proclamation to the whole world, it was Daniel's God he was writing about, the God of the young man who had told him the truth in the throne room years before, who had warned him privately that the dream was bad news for him, who had begged him to repent in a way that left the door open without making any guarantees. The greatest king of the ancient world spent 7 years in a field learning what a Hebrew exile had tried to tell him in a single conversation. Nebuchadnezzar looked up, and what he saw when he looked up was the same thing Daniel had been looking at from the beginning. Chapter 7. The Man Who Outlasted the King. Nebuchadnezzar died sometime around 562 before the Common Era. He had reigned for 43 years. He had built Babylon into the greatest city the ancient world had ever produced. He had defeated Egypt, destroyed Jerusalem, carried thousands of people into exile, administered an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the border of Egypt, and at the very end of his life, written a proclamation to the whole world about the God of a Hebrew exile who had told him the truth when no one else would. He died in his bed. As kings go, that is not the worst ending. Daniel was still alive. This is the detail that the narrative does not pause to emphasize, but that becomes more significant the longer you think about it. Daniel had arrived in Babylon as a teenager during the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, which places his arrival somewhere around 605 before the Common Era. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562. That is more than 40 years. Daniel had been in Babylon for 40 years, and the king who brought him there was gone, and Daniel was still there. Still serving, still working inside the system that had tried to rename him on his first day. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil Merodach, took the throne. He reigned for 2 years before being assassinated by his brother-in-law Neriglissar, who ruled for 4 years, whose young son Labashi Marduk lasted only a few months before being removed in a palace coup. Then came Nabonidus, one of the strangest figures in the history of the ancient Near East. A king who developed a religious obsession with the moon god, Sin, moved his court to the desert oasis of Tema in Arabia, and left his son Belshazzar to govern Babylon in his absence. 4 kings in less than 20 years. An empire that looked permanent from the outside was cycling through rulers like a corporation burning through CEOs during a crisis. Daniel served through all of it. We do not have a detailed account of what those middle years looked like. The text does not give us a chapter on Daniel during the reign of Evil Merodach or a scene from the court of Neriglissar. The narrative skips forward, and what fills the gap is mostly silence. But the silence is not empty. What the text gives us, in the absence of dramatic events, is a single detail about Daniel's daily life that turns out to be the most important detail in the entire story. He prayed 3 times a day, every day, with his windows open toward Jerusalem. That detail appears later in the narrative as evidence used against him by his enemies. Evidence that he is still practicing his faith despite a royal decree against it. But what it reveals, in the context of these quiet middle years, is something about how Daniel actually survived intact across 5 decades in a foreign empire. He was not surviving on the memory of his faith. He was not coasting on the spiritual momentum of his early convictions. The food refusal, and the dream interpretation, and the years of training He was doing something every day that kept the thing alive, that could most easily have died quietly in the middle of a long and successful career. 3 times a day. Windows open. Facing Jerusalem. Think about what that looked like in practice. Daniel Vuss. By the middle years of his career, a senior official in the Babylonian imperial administration, he had responsibilities. He had a schedule. He had people waiting for his decisions and documents requiring his attention and political situations demanding his judgment. He was not living in a monastery. He was living in the center of one of the most complex and demanding political environments in the ancient world. And 3 times a day, he stopped what he was doing and turned toward Jerusalem and prayed. Jerusalem that he had not seen in decades. Jerusalem that had been destroyed. The temple burned. The walls torn down. The city emptied. Jerusalem that existed now primarily as a direction to face. A reminder of who he was and whose he was in a city that kept offering him better answers to both those questions. The windows open toward Jerusalem were an act of memory. They were Daniel's daily refusal to let Babylon become the only story. Every morning, every midday, every evening, he turned away from the empire and toward the ruins of something that Babylon had destroyed and that he continued to believe was not finished. He had learned this practice from a long tradition. The Psalms were full of it. The discipline of remembering, of deliberately bringing to mind what you know to be true when the immediate environment is not reinforcing it, of creating regular moments in an ordinary day when the larger story interrupts the smaller one. This is something anyone who has ever tried to hold on to a conviction in an environment hostile to it will recognize immediately. You do not survive that kind of sustained pressure on willpower alone. You survive it by building habits that do the remembering for you on the days when your willpower is occupied with something else. Daniel had built those habits decades ago, and he had maintained them through 4 kings and countless administrative crises and the daily pressure of being a person of one world trying to function at the highest level of a completely different world. 3 times a day. Windows open. Jerusalem. Now consider what those middle years were actually asking of him emotionally. He was a man without a country. The country that had made him who he was did not exist anymore in any functional sense. His people were scattered across the empire. Many of them assimilated to varying degrees into Babylonian culture. Some of them completely absorbed. The elders and the priests and the prophets who had shaped his early understanding of God and Israel and covenant were mostly gone. He was, in many ways, one of the last people standing who could remember Jerusalem as a living city rather than a historical reference. There is a specific loneliness to that, not the loneliness of isolation, because Daniel was surrounded by people, embedded in one of the most socially complex environments imaginable, but the loneliness of being the person in the room who remembers something that the room has no category for. The loneliness of carrying a story that the people around you have either forgotten or never known. Jeremiah, the prophet who had watched Jerusalem fall and had wept over it in words so raw they fill an entire book of the Bible, had written a letter to the exiles in Babylon. He had told them to build houses and plant gardens and take wives and raise children and seek the welfare of the city where they had been sent. He had told them that their welfare was connected to Babylon's welfare, and that they should pray for it. Daniel had done exactly that. He had sought the welfare of Babylon at the highest possible level. He had given his best work to the administration of an empire that had destroyed his homeland. He had served faithfully and competently through 4 kings. Not because he had given up on Jerusalem, but because he understood that being faithful where you actually are is not the same as approving of how you got there. But the praying toward Jerusalem 3 times a day was the counterweight. It was the thing that kept the faithful service from becoming absorption. It was the thing that said, I serve here, but I belong somewhere else. I do the work of this place, but I have not forgotten what place I am actually from. The empire offered him a complete identity, a title, a role, a position in the hierarchy, a set of responsibilities that could have filled his entire sense of self if he had let them. Many people in his position let them. It is the easiest thing in the world to let your professional identity become your whole identity, especially when the professional identity comes with as much status and responsibility as Daniel's did. He did not let it. 3 times a day he turned away from the empire and remembered. And the remembering is what made every other thing he did sustainable. The food refusal had been possible because he knew who he was. The dream interpretation had been possible because he knew who he was. The counsel to Nebuchadnezzar had been possible because he knew who he was. And knowing who he was, across 40 years of sustained pressure in a foreign empire, was possible because 3 times a day, every day, he did the deliberate work of not forgetting. There is a word in Hebrew that appears throughout the Psalms and the prophets. The word sakar, to remember. It is not a passive word. It does not describe the automatic recall of something stored in memory. It describes an active, intentional turning of the mind towards something specific. A deliberate act of bringing something from the past into the present so that it can shape what happens next. Daniel practiced zakar 3 times a day. He remembered Israel and Jerusalem and the God who had chosen both. He remembered the covenant and the promises and the history of a people who had been in impossible situations before and had discovered that the God they served was not limited by the impossibility of the situation. He remembered, and the remembering kept him who he was. The middle years passed. Kings rose and fell. The empire continued its slow internal rot beneath the gleaming surface of its walls and monuments. Nabonidus sat in the desert of Arabia, arguing about the moon god. Belshazzar ran the government from Babylon and threw parties. And somewhere in the administrative machinery of the greatest empire in the ancient world, an old man opened his window 3 times a day and prayed toward the ruins of a city that most people had stopped thinking about. He was still Daniel. He had always been Daniel. And the night was coming when that fact would matter more than anything else in the world. Chapter 8. The Writing on the Wall. Belshazzar made a feast for 1,000 of his lords. The text gives us that number with the confidence of a guest list. 1,000. And it is worth holding for a moment because it is not just a number. It is an atmosphere. 1,000 of the most powerful men in the Babylonian Empire, gathered in the greatest palace in the ancient world, eating and drinking at the table of the king who ran the empire while his father sat in a desert arguing about theology. The wine was flowing. The text emphasizes this. The wine was flowing and Belshazzar was drinking, and the mood in the room was the mood that powerful people in secure positions develop when they have gone long enough without being reminded that their security is not as total as it feels. Babylon was actually under threat at that moment. The army of Cyrus the Persian had been moving through the region for years, systematically dismantling the outer defenses of the empire. The city of Babylon itself was surrounded, but the walls of Babylon were considered impregnable. They were the engineering achievement of the ancient world. The thing that people pointed to when they wanted to argue that some structures simply could not be overcome. Babylon behind its walls was Babylon safe. Or so the thinking went. So Belshazzar threw a party. And then he made a decision that the text records without editorial comment, but that carries the weight of everything that has been building since chapter 1. He commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought out. The vessels from the temple. The cups and bowls and plates that had been used in the worship of the God of Israel, consecrated for that purpose, taken when the temple was looted and brought to Babylon as trophies of conquest. They had been sitting in the treasury for decades, preserved but unused, too politically significant to discard and too foreign to use in ordinary Babylonian religious practice. Belshazzar brought them out and filled them with wine and passed them around the room, and as the wine was poured from cups consecrated to the God of Israel, Belshazzar and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. This moment is doing several things simultaneously. It is the most explicit act of blasphemy in the entire book of Daniel. A direct and deliberate use of sacred objects in the service of a competing theology. But it is also something more than that. It is Babylon at its most confident, making its most comprehensive claim. We have taken your city, your people, your future, your best young men, your temple vessels. We have taken all of it. And now we are drinking from your holy cups and singing to our gods, and there is nothing your God can do about it. That is the atmosphere in the room when the hand appears. Immediately, the text uses that word again. The same word it used when Nebuchadnezzar spoke, and the voice from heaven fell while the words were still in his mouth. The hand appeared while the party was still going. Not after. Not when the mood had sobered or the implications of what they were doing had had time to settle. In the middle of the drinking and the singing and the celebration, a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand, where the king could see it clearly. Just the hand, not an arm, not a body, a hand, emerging from nothing, writing on the wall in the light of the lamps. Visible to everyone in the room, Belshazzar's color changed. The text is specific about his body. His color changed. His thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king of the most powerful empire in the world, surrounded by 1,000 of his most powerful lords, in the most fortified city in the ancient world, had his knees knocking together at the sight of a hand. He cried aloud to bring in the enchanters and the Chaldeans and the astrologers. He promised whoever could read the writing and tell him its interpretation, the third highest position in the kingdom, a purple robe and a gold chain. The wise men came. They looked at the writing. None of them could read it. The queen came into the banquet hall, not Belshazzar's wife, but almost certainly his mother or grandmother, a woman old enough to remember the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, old enough to remember what had happened in the throne room decades before, when there had been another mystery that the Chaldeans could not solve. She told him about Daniel. "There is a man in your kingdom," she said, "in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, made him chief of the magicians, enchantés, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Your father made him chief." The implication is clear. Belshazzar had either not known about Daniel or had chosen not to use him. The old man who had served Nebuchadnezzar and outlasted 3 subsequent kings had been sitting somewhere in the administrative structure of Babylon, unknown or unnoticed by the man currently running the empire. Daniel was brought in. The king looked at him and offered him the same deal he had offered the other wise men. Third in the kingdom, a purple robe, a gold chain. Read the writing and interpret it, and all of this is yours. Daniel said he could keep his gifts and give the rewards to someone else. Then he said something that nobody in that room was expecting. He gave Belshazzar a history lesson. "O king," he said, "the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Because of the greatness he gave him, all peoples, nation, and languages trembled and feared before him. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will." Nebuchadnezzar knew this. Daniel said. He had learned it. It had cost him 7 years in a field. But he had learned it, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Although you knew all this, that phrase is the heart of Daniel's speech. Belshazzar was not ignorant of what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. The story was known. The proclamation had been sent to every corner of the empire. He had grown up in the shadow of a grandfather who had been brought low by the God whose temple vessels he was currently drinking from. He knew, And he had done it anyway. "You have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven," Daniel said, "and the vessels of his house have been brought before you. And you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways. You have not honored the God in whose hand is your breath." Then God sent the hand of this message, and Daniel read it. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. 3 words, with the first repeated, numbered, numbered, wahid, divided. Daniel gave the interpretation without softening it, without framing it diplomatically, without finding a way to deliver the news that left Belshazzar some room to maneuver. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That is it. That is the complete message. Your time is up. You came up short. It is already over. Belshazzar honored his promise. He clothed Daniel in purple and put a gold chain around his neck and proclaimed that he was the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. That night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. The party was still happening, or had just ended, when the city fell. Ancient sources outside the Bible describe the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Persian in 539 before the Common Era as an almost bloodless event. The Persian army had diverted the Euphrates River and entered the city through the riverbed while the population was celebrating a festival. The gates were open. The guards were distracted. Babylon, the city with the impregnable walls, fell not through the walls but under them, through the channel that the river had cut through the center of the city. The greatest empire in the world ended on a night when its king was throwing a party, and the writing on the wall had already told him it was over. There is a phrase that comes from this story that has entered the English language so completely that many people who use it have no idea where it comes from. When someone says they can see the writing on the wall, they mean they can read the signs that something is coming to an end, that the trajectory is clear even if the arrival has not happened yet. Daniel could always see the writing on the wall. That was his specific gift and his specific burden. He had been reading the signs since the throne room of Nebuchadnezzar, since the first dream, since the food refusal on his first week in Babylon. He had been telling the truth about what he saw to people who often did not want to hear it, doing so without softening the message or managing the delivery for political effect. In that banquet hall, surrounded by 1,000 of the most powerful people in the world, with a hand writing on the wall and a king whose knees were knocking together, Daniel was the only person in the room who could tell the truth. Not because he was the only one who could read the letters, but because he was the only one who had spent 50 years practicing the specific discipline of saying what was true, regardless of what saying it cost him. That is what the food refusal had been preparing him for. That is what the prayer 3 times a day had been sustaining him toward. All those decades of small, faithful acts in ordinary moments had produced a man who could walk into the most dramatic moment of the most powerful empire in the world and say what needed to be said without needing a purple robe or a gold chain to do it. He told the truth. Babylon ended, and Daniel, who had arrived as a teenager through the Ishtar gate, was still standing when the gate changed hands. He was still Daniel, and the empire that had tried to rename him on his first day was gone. Chapter 9. The Lions and the Law That Could Not Be Changed. The empire changed hands overnight. One morning Babylon was Babylonian, and by the following morning it was something else entirely. The administrative machinery kept running because administrative machinery always keeps running, because someone has to collect the taxes and manage the grain supply and settle the disputes and keep the roads passable, regardless of whose name is on the top of the official correspondence. Empire fall. Bureaucracies adapt. Daniel adapted. This is worth noting because it would have been entirely understandable if he had not. He was old by now, somewhere in his 70s. A man who had given the best decades of his life to the service of an empire that was now simply gone. He had outlasted Nebuchadnezzar and evil Merodach and Neriglissar and Nabonidus and Belshazzar. He had served through the rise and the peak and the slow internal decay of the most powerful civilization the ancient world had produced. He had earned the right, by any reasonable measure, to step back. Instead, Darius the Mede appointed him as one of 3 presidents over the 120 satraps who governed the provinces of the new empire. And then Daniel distinguished himself above the other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. The same pattern: a new empire, a new king, and Daniel rising to the top of it, not by maneuvering or by leveraging his knowledge of the previous administration, but simply by being genuinely excellent at the work. This troubled people. The other presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Read that carefully. These were not lazy or careless investigators. These were men whose careers and possibly their lives depended on finding something they could use against Daniel. They looked hard. They looked at his administrative record, his financial dealings, his handling of provincial matters, his management of subordinates, his correspondence, his decisions. They looked everywhere, that a man with 50 years of government service might have accumulated something that could be used against him. They found nothing. And so they said to one another, "We will not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." This is a remarkable sentence. His enemies were not attacking him because he had done something wrong. They were attacking him because the only thing they could find in him that distinguished him from a perfect Babylonian official was that he was not a Babylonian. The only flaw they could locate in 5 decades of public service was that he prayed to a different god. They designed a trap around that fact. They went to Darius and proposed a new law. For 30 days, they said, no one in the kingdom should make petition to any god or man except to the king himself. Anyone who violated the decree would be thrown into the den of lions. They framed it as an honor to the king, a month of exclusive loyalty, a gesture of devotion to the new ruler of a new empire. Darius liked it. He signed it. And because the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be revoked once established, the trap was set and the door was closed. Then Daniel went home. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. 5 words that carry 50 years of history. This was not a new habit adopted in defiance of the new decree. This was not a political statement or a public protest or a deliberate act of civil disobedience designed to make a point. This was what Daniel had been doing every day for decades. The decree had been signed. The trap had been set. And Daniel went home and did what he had always done. Because the thing he had always done was not something he was willing to stop doing because a king had signed a piece of paper. His enemies were watching. They saw him. They went to the king and reminded him of the decree. They pointed out that Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, paid no attention to the king or to the decree that had been signed, but made his petition 3 times a day. Darius was deeply distressed. The text says he set his mind to deliver Daniel and labored until the sun went down to rescue him. He was looking for a legal mechanism, any provision in the law that would give him room to maneuver. He found none. The law of the Medes and the Persians could not be changed. He had signed it himself. The trap that his officials had designed to catch Daniel had also caught him. He said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And then he had Daniel thrown into the den of lions. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, so that nothing could be changed concerning Daniel. And then Darius went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him. His sleep fled from him. Sit with that image for a moment. The most powerful man in the new empire, sitting in his palace in the middle of the night, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to be distracted by anything his court could offer him. His law had worked exactly as designed. The man his officials had targeted was in the den. The decree was sealed. The process had functioned correctly according to every legal standard, and the king could not sleep. This is the particular torture of a powerful person trapped inside the logical consequences of their own decisions. Darius had the power to move armies and redraw borders and redistribute wealth across an entire empire. He did not have the power to reach into a den of lions and undo what his signature had set in motion. The law of the Medes and the Persians was supposed to be a feature, a guarantee of reliability and predictability that made the empire trustworthy. It had become a cage, and in the den, the night passed. We do not know what Daniel did in that den. The text does not give us his inner experience of the night, does not tell us whether he was afraid or peaceful, or somewhere in the complicated territory between those two things. We know he was old. We know he was in a dark place with lions. We know that the God he had been praying toward 3 times a day for 50 years was the only thing standing between him and a very particular kind of death. The text does not dramatize it. It just moves to the morning. At break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. He cried out with a troubled voice. He said, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" There is something in the way Darius phrased that question that reveals the depth of his uncertainty. He did not ask it as a formality. He asked it as a man who had spent all night not knowing the answer and was desperate to find out. "Has your God been able?" And Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you. O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad. He commanded Daniel taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Then Darius gave the order, and the men who had accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions with their wives and their children. The lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they even reached the bottom of the den. The contrast is deliberate, and the text does not soften it. Daniel spent the night in the den and was found without harm. His accusers were in the den for seconds and were already broken before they hit the ground. The difference was not the lions. The same lions, the same den, radically different outcomes. Then Darius wrote to all the peoples, nation, and languages that dwell in all the earth. He wrote a decree declaring that in all his royal dominion, people were to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has saved Daniel from the power of lions? This is the second time in the book of Daniel that a foreign king has issued a decree about the God of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar had done it after the furnace. Now Darius was doing it after the lions. The most powerful men in 2 successive empires had both been moved to make official proclamations about a God they did not worship, because they had watched what that God did when his people were placed in situations that should have ended them. But here is the thing that deserves the most attention in this whole episode. The thing that the dramatic elements of the story can obscure if we are not careful. The lion's den was not the test. The test happened before the lions. In Daniel's house, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, the test was the ordinary evening after the decree was signed. When Daniel went home and got down on his knees and did the thing he had always done, nobody was going to see it or report it or make a proclamation about it. Nobody was watching except his enemies and his God. And in that ordinary moment, in the privacy of his own house, he made the same decision he had been making for 50 years. He prayed. The lion's den was the consequence of the prayer. The miracle of the den was the vindication of the prayer. But the prayer itself, the quiet, daily, unremarkable-looking act of getting down on his knees 3 times a day in his own house, with the windows open toward a ruined city. That was the actual life Daniel was living, and that life, maintained across 50 years and 5 kings and 2 empires, was what produced a man who could be sealed in a lion's den at night and emerge in the morning without harm and with the calm presence of mind to say, "O King, live forever." The discipline made the miracle possible. The prayer made the den survivable. The 50 years of small, faithful acts in ordinary moments made the extraordinary moment into something that looked, from the inside, like just another day. Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He was still there, still serving, still Daniel. And in the silence of the next few years, while the world continued to rearrange itself around him, something was happening inside him that the first half of his story had not prepared anyone for. He was beginning to receive visions, and they were nothing like anything he had experienced before. Chapter 10. The Turn. What the other half is about. We need to stop here. Not because the story is pausing. It is not pausing. Daniel is still in Babylon, still serving, still praying 3 times a day with his windows open toward Jerusalem. The story is continuing in every practical sense, but something is about to change in the way the story is told. And if we do not take a moment to explain what is changing and why, the second half of Daniel is going to feel like a different book, like 2 separate documents bound together by accident. And it is not. It is one continuous story, told in 2 different registers. And understanding the relationship between those registers is the key to understanding what Daniel is actually about. Here is the simplest way to say it. In the first 9 chapters, Daniel sees what empire looks like from the inside. He sees it from the position of a man who works within it, navigates its politics, serves its kings, endures its pressures, and survives its attempts to destroy him. He sees Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Darius from the position of someone who has to figure out how to be faithful in rooms those men control. The view is from the ground level, specific, personal, embedded in the daily reality of what it actually costs to be a person of conscience inside a system that does not share your conscience. In the chapters that follow, Daniel sees what empire looks like from somewhere else entirely. He sees it from above, from the vantage point of a vision that strips away the gold and the ceremony and the military power and the administrative machinery and shows the thing underneath. And what is underneath is not what the empire presents itself as being. The gold and the silver and the bronze that Nebuchadnezzar's statue was made of. The gleaming, impressive, awe-inspiring materials of imperial self-presentation. Those are not what Daniel sees in the visions. He sees beasts, 4 of them, coming up from the sea, wilt, hungry, breaking and devouring, moving through the world the way predators move through a landscape, not with the dignity of kings, but with the instinctive violence of creatures that do not recognize anything as off-limits. And above the beasts, in the visions, there is a courtroom, a throne, someone the text calls the Ancient of Days, seated, white-haired, attended by thousands. With the books open and judgment beginning, we are going to spend several chapters in that courtroom. We are going to sit with those beasts and try to understand what they are and what the visions are doing by showing them to Daniel at this particular stage of his life. We are going to take the language of the second half of Daniel seriously, not as a code to be deciphered into a prediction chart, but as a specific kind of seeing that only becomes available after a person has spent long enough inside the thing being described. But first, We need to understand why this language exists at all. When you are living under an empire that controls what can be said publicly, when the honest description of your situation would get you killed if you said it plainly, you develop a language of images and symbols and coded references that carries the real meaning underneath the visible surface. The beasts are not exotic monsters invented for dramatic effect. The beasts are empires. Real empires. The specific empires that Daniel and the people who read his story had actually lived under and suffered under and survived under. The visions were not an escape from historical reality into fantasy. They were a way of seeing historical reality more clearly than the official version allowed. When you call an empire a beast, you are saying something specific and something true. You are saying that underneath the gold of the statue, underneath the ceremony and the administration and the legal structures and the cultural achievements, there is something that operates according to a logic that has more in common with predation than with justice. Something that devours rather than protects. Something that does not recognize the dignity of what it consumes. Daniel had been living inside the beast for 50 years. He had served it and navigated it and survived it, and in many ways made it function better than it would have without him. He knew its inner workings as well as any man alive. And now, in the later decades of his life, he was being shown what the thing he had spent his life inside actually was. And what he saw frightened him. That is perhaps the most important thing to carry into the second half of this story. Daniel was not excited by the visions. He was not energized by the revelation of hidden knowledge or thrilled by his access to information about the future. He was frightened. He was disturbed. He was sick. He was overwhelmed to the point of physical collapse. Multiple times. By what he was being shown. The man who had stood calmly before Nebuchadnezzar and told him the truth about the statue. The man who had walked into Belshazzar's banquet hall and read the writing on the wall without flinching. The man who had spent the night in a den of lions and emerged in the morning with the composure to greet the king with formal courtesy. That man was being shown things in the visions that left him pale and shaking on the ground. That made him sick for days. That he said he did not understand, even after being given explanations by heavenly messengers. The visions were larger than Daniel. And the gap between what he was being shown and what he could fully comprehend was not a failure of intelligence or faith. It was the honest condition of a finite human being standing at the edge of something that exceeded the capacity of finite human beings to fully contain. This is the second half of Daniel's story. A frightened old man, faithful for 50 years, being shown something so large that all he can do at the end of it is take the instruction he is given and keep walking. We need to go into that territory carefully, and we need to remember, as we go in, that the man being shown these things is the same man who refused the king's food as a teenager and opened his windows toward Jerusalem 3 times a day for 50 years. The visions do not make Daniel into someone different. They are being given to someone who has already been shaped, over decades of small, faithful decisions, into a person capable of receiving them. The ground was prepared long before the visions came, and what is planted in prepared ground grows differently than what is planted anywhere else. Chapter 11. The 4 beasts and the one who was ancient. The first vision came in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel was in his bed when it arrived. Not in the throne room, not in the middle of a crisis, not standing before a king who needed an interpretation. He was asleep, and what came to him in the night was not someone else's dream requiring his explanation. It was his own vision, given directly to him, and it was unlike anything he had experienced in 50 years of serving in the courts of the most powerful empires in the world. He saw the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the Great Sea. In the ancient Near Eastern imagination, the Great Sea was not simply a body of water. It was the primordial deep, the place where order had not yet been established, where the formless and the wild had their origin. When the 4 winds stirred it up, what came out was not something that had been brought into being by the careful hand of a creator. What came out was something that had been waiting in the deep, something shaped by chaos rather than by intention. 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, each one different from the others. The first was like a lion but had the wings of an eagle. As Daniel watched, its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human mind was given to it. The second beast was like a bear, raised up on one side, with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. A voice said to it, "Arise and devour much flesh." The third was like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Then came the fourth. The text slows down at the 4th beast. It gives it more words than the other 3 combined, and even then the words feel insufficient, because Daniel cannot find an animal to compare it to. He calls it terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, and it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that had come before it, and it had 10 horns. While Daniel was thinking about the horns, a little horn came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were plucked up before it. And in that horn were eyes like human eyes, and a mouth speaking great things. Now the scene shifted. Thrones were placed. The Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames with wheels of burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The little horn was still speaking great things. And as Daniel watched, the 4th beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. The dominion of the other beasts was also taken away, though their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And then, from the clouds, Daniel saw someone coming, someone like a son of man, like a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days. And he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. Daniel had just watched 4 beasts rise from the sea, tear through the world, devour and break and stamp everything in their path, and then be brought before a courtroom and have their power stripped away. And the dominion that had been theirs was given instead to someone who came not from the sea, but from the clouds, not from the chaos below, but from somewhere above, and who looked not like a beast, but like a human being. The contrast is everything. Think about what Daniel had spent 50 years watching. He had watched Nebuchadnezzar build the greatest empire in the ancient world and then eat grass in a field for 7 years before he understood who actually held the authority he thought was his. He had watched Belshazzar drink from the temple vessels and read the handwriting on the wall that same night. He had watched empires rise and fall and rise again, each one presenting itself as the definitive arrangement of power, each one eventually giving way to something else. And now in the vision he was seeing the logic underneath all of it. The beasts did not rise because they were supposed to rise. They rose from the sea, from chaos, from the primordial deep, and they operated according to the logic of the sea. They devoured, they broke, they stamped, they consumed, not because they were created for that purpose, but because that is what creatures shaped by chaos do. But the courtroom was real. The Ancient of Days was seated. The books were open. And whatever the beasts did in the time they were given to operate, there was a reckoning coming that they could not prevent. A judgment that did not require their cooperation or their acknowledgement to proceed. And the dominion that came out of that courtroom was not given to the fiercest beast or the one with the most iron teeth. It was given to someone who looked like a human being. When you call an empire a beast, you are saying something true. You are saying that underneath the gold, underneath the ceremony and the administration and the legal structures and the cultural achievements, there is something that operates according to a logic that has more in common with predation than with justice. The beasts devour. The Son of Man receives. The beasts accumulate power through violence. The Son of Man is given authority through a courtroom. The beasts come from below, from chaos, from the deep. The Son of Man comes from above, from the direction of the one who sits on the throne. Daniel, who had spent 50 years watching the beasts operate from the inside, who had navigated their courts and served their kings and survived their attempts to destroy him, was now being shown what the whole thing looked like from the perspective of the courtroom. He approached one of those standing there and asked him the truth concerning all this. And the one standing there told him, "The 4 beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever. Forever and ever. The saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom." Sit with that sentence inside the specific life of the person receiving it. Daniel had given 50 years to empires that were not his. He had watched Jerusalem destroyed, and the temple burned and his people scattered. He had served inside the machinery of 2 successive empires that had done the scattering. And now he was being told that the ones who had been scattered were the ones who would ultimately receive what the empires had been fighting over all along. He was troubled. The text says, "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed. But I kept the matter in my heart." The man who had never flinched before Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or Darius looked at the vision of the courtroom and came out of it pale and shaking, because it was so much larger than anything he had been looking at from the ground level. 50 years of navigating the courts of the most powerful men in the ancient world. And now he was being shown the court, above all courts. The judgment, above all judgments. The Ancient of Days, above all kings. And the scale of it was more than he could hold without trembling. He kept the matter in his heart, and he kept walking. Chapter 12. The Ram, the Goat, and the Limits of Sight. 2 years after the first vision, another one came. Daniel was standing beside the Ulai Canal, in the citadel of Susa, and he saw a ram. It had 2 horns, one higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. The ram charged westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before it. It did what it wanted and became great. Then from the west came a goat with a conspicuous horn between its eyes. It crossed the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The speed of it was impossible. Something moving faster than anything that moved on legs should be able to move. It came to the ram in great fury and struck it and broke its 2 horns. The ram had no power to stand before it. The goat trampled the ram, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became exceedingly great. And then at the height of its power, the great horn was broken. And in its place 4 conspicuous horns came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn that grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew until it reached the host of heaven, and threw some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled on them. It even magnified itself against the prince of the host. The regular burnt offering was taken away. The place of the sanctuary was overthrown, and the horn prospered in everything it did and threw truth to the ground. Truth thrown to the ground. Daniel heard a holy one speak. And another holy one said, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled?" And the answer came, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. What Daniel felt when he heard that is not described in calm theological categories. The text says he sought to understand the vision and then fell into a deep sleep on his face when Gabriel appeared to explain it. He had to be touched to stand up, and after everything was explained, he was sick for days. Gabriel told him the vision concerned the time of the end, that the ram was the kings of Media and Persia, that the goat was the king of Greece, that the great horn was the first king, and the 4 horns that followed were 4 kingdoms arising from that nation, and from one of them would come a king of bold face, a destroyer of mighty men and of the people who are the saints. A man who would throw truth to the ground and succeed. He shall be broken. Gabriel said, but by no human hand. Daniel sat with that. A conqueror broken by something other than a stronger army. A man who had thrown truth to the ground and prospered. Destroyed not by the normal mechanisms of history, but by something that operated outside those mechanisms entirely. He was appalled by the vision, and he rose and went about the king's business. That sentence is one of the most understated lines in the entire book. He was appalled by what he had been shown, and then he got up and went to work. He did not retreat. He did not spend days in theological paralysis, trying to decode everything he had seen before he could function again. He was appalled, and he rose. That is a very specific kind of faith. The kind that does not require resolution before movement. The kind that can hold what it does not understand in one hand and continue doing what it has always done with the other. He went about the king's business, and the windows stayed open toward Jerusalem. Chapter 13. The Man Beside the River. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a final word came to Daniel. He had been in mourning for 3 weeks before it arrived. 3 weeks of fasting. No rich food. No meat. No wine. Nothing applied to his body to make it comfortable. He does not explain why in the text. He simply was mourning. The way a person mourns when they have seen too much and carried too much, and the weight of all of it has finally settled into the body in a way that requires an outward expression to match the inward reality. Perhaps he had heard reports about the initial return of the exiles to Jerusalem and felt the gap between the promise and what the returning exiles actually found. The 70 years were technically over. A small group had gone back under Zerubbabel. But the temple had not been rebuilt. The walls were still rubble. The Jerusalem they had returned to was a shadow of the city that existed in Daniel's memory from childhood. And he had not been a child in a very long time. Or perhaps, at his age, with everything he had seen in the visions, he had simply arrived at a place where mourning was the only honest posture left. He was in his 80s. He had received things that no human being was designed to receive without cost. And the cost had accumulated across decades in ways that were finally making themselves felt in his body and his spirit simultaneously. 3 weeks. No food worth mentioning. And then, on the 24th day of the 1st month, he was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris. He lifted his eyes and looked. What he saw was a man. The man was clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl. His face was like the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches. His arms and legs were like the gleam of burnished bronze. And the sound of his words was like the sound of a multitude. Like a crowd of thousands, all speaking at once from a single source. The men who were with Daniel did not see the vision. But a great trembling fell on them and they fled to hide themselves. They felt something they could not see, and it was enough to send them running. Daniel was left alone. And what happened next in his body happened before he had time to make any decision about it. No strength remained in him. His radiant appearance was fearfully changed, meaning the color left his face. The composure that had carried him through the courts of 4 kings and 2 empires simply drained away. And he retained no strength at all. He was standing on the bank of the Tigris, and then he was not standing. He was on the ground, on his face, with the sound of those words still moving through him like water through ground that cannot hold it. He fell into a deep sleep with his face to the ground. Now stop here and think about who this is. This is the man who had stood in front of Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful king of the most powerful empire in the ancient world, and told him that his power was temporary without flinching. This is the man who had walked into Belshazzar's banquet hall, read the handwriting on the wall in front of 1,000 people, and delivered a death sentence to a king without softening a single word. This is the man who had spent the night in a den of lions and emerged the next morning with the composure to greet the king with formal courtesy. This is the man who had faced every pressure the ancient world could generate and had not been moved by any of it. That man was on his face on the ground beside the Tigris River. Out cold. The presence he was in the proximity of was not a king. It was not an empire. It was not any human power or any institutional authority or any of the things that Daniel had learned across 50 years to navigate with skill and composure. And it was not the quiet interior presence that he had been praying toward 3 times a day for decades. The presence that sustained him through the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. This was something else. Something whose face was like lightning and whose eyes were like fire and whose voice was like a multitude. Something so far outside the category of what Daniel had previously encountered that his body, trained by 50 years of staying composed in impossible situations, simply gave way. He could not stand. A hand touched him, not a voice first. Not words. A touch. The thing that was there. The one standing over him while he lay on his face in the dirt. Chose to reach down and touch him. And the text says the touch set him trembling on his hands and knees. He was on his hands and knees, trembling, when the voice came, "O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright. For now I have been sent to you, man greatly loved." Those 3 words landed on Daniel while he was on his hands and knees in the dirt beside a river, pale and trembling. Every ounce of composure he had spent 50 years building completely dissolved. And what the voice chose to lead with was not information, was not instruction, was not explanation of the vision he was about to receive. The voice chose to tell him who he was to the one sending the message. Man greatly loved. Daniel stood up trembling. He was standing, but the trembling had not stopped. And then he spoke. He said, "O my Lord, by reason of the vision pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant talk with my Lord? For now no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me." Read that carefully. Daniel was not performing humility. He was reporting a physical reality. The vision had taken something from him that he did not have the ability to simply replace by deciding to have it. He had no strength. He had no breath. He was standing upright because he had been told to stand upright. But standing upright and being capable of receiving what was coming were 2 different things. And he was honest enough to say so. "How can I talk with you? I have nothing left." That is not what you expect from Daniel. Daniel is the man who always had something left. Daniel is the man who, after a night in the lion's den, came out and said, "O king, live forever," with the same measured courtesy he would have used on an ordinary morning. Daniel is the man whose composure had been the most consistent thing about him across the entire length of his life in Babylon. And here, beside the Tigris River, at the end of his life, with the weight of 50 years of faithfulness and 3 weeks of fasting and the accumulated pressure of visions he had not fully understood, Daniel was telling the truth about his own emptiness. He had nothing left. And that is when the second touch came. One having the appearance of a human being touched his lips. His lips, not his shoulder, not his head, not his hands. His lips, the specific place on his body from which words came, the instrument of everything he had said in all those years of telling the truth to kings who did not always want to hear it. And Daniel opened his mouth and spoke. He said, "O my Lord, by reason of the vision pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength." The touch on his lips gave him the ability to say what he had just said, which was that he still had no strength. The touch enabled him to speak, and what he spoke was the same confession he had just made. The strength to admit his weakness was itself a gift. He could not get there on his own. He needed to be touched to say out loud what was true about him. Again, one having human appearance touched him and strengthened him. A third touch, and this time the words were different. "O man greatly loved, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage." The same greeting, the same identity spoken back to him. Man greatly loved. And then the 3 things he needed most in that moment. Not information about the vision, not a theological framework, not a decoded interpretation of everything he had been shown. Peace, strength, courage. Be strong and of good courage. Those are the same words God had spoken to Joshua at the Jordan River before Israel crossed into the Promised Land. The same words Moses had spoken over his successor at the end of his life. The words given to people standing at the edge of something they were not sure they could cross, standing at the threshold of territory that was too large for them to hold in their minds all at once, but that they had been called to enter anyway. And Daniel said, "Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Not I am ready, not I understand now, not the composure is back and we can proceed normally. Just you have strengthened me. What you did to me across those 3 touches was real. I am not who I was before the touches, and I am not yet who I need to be. But something has been given to me that was not there before. Let my Lord speak." That is the most honest thing Daniel says in the entire book, and it comes at the end of his life, on his face on the ground beside a river, after 3 weeks of fasting and a vision that knocked him unconscious before it even fully began. The man who had been composed in the courts of 4 kings was on the ground. The man who had told the truth to the most powerful men in the ancient world had just confessed he had nothing left. The man who had never publicly flinched was trembling on his hands and knees in the dirt, and he was stronger in that moment, the text suggests, than he had been in any of the throne rooms. Because what the 3 touches had given him was not the return of his own composure. It was something that came from outside him entirely. Something he could not have generated or maintained on his own. Something that had to be placed in him by a hand reaching down from somewhere above the bank of the Tigris. Man greatly loved. He had heard that phrase before. Twice. Earlier in the visions. But here, on the ground. After the 50 years and the 3 weeks of fasting and the vision that left him breathless and pale, he heard it differently. Because when you have nothing left, when the composure is gone, and the strength is gone, and the breath is almost gone, and you are on your hands and knees in the dirt, the statement that you are greatly loved by the one who is standing over you is not a theological proposition. It is the only thing that can get you back on your feet. He stood. "Let my Lord speak," he said, "for you have strengthened me." And what was spoken to Daniel in that moment? The long vision that followed about kings of the north and kings of the south and the abomination that makes desolate, was received by a man who had just learned something that 50 years of composure in the courts of empires could not have taught him. He learned that the ground is not the worst place to be when the one standing over you is the one who calls you greatly loved. He learned that strength given from the outside is stronger than strength maintained from the inside. He learned that saying "I have nothing left" to the right person is not the end of the conversation. It is often the beginning of the real one. He stood. He listened. He received the longest vision of his life, stretching across the rest of chapter 10 and all of chapters 11 and 12. A panorama of kings and wars and betrayals and suffering and the abomination that makes desolate and the shattering of the power of the holy people and the resurrection of the dead to everlasting life. He received all of it on legs that were still trembling. And when it was over, he asked the question he had to ask. He said, "O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" He had heard everything. He had received the longest and most detailed vision he had ever been given. He had been touched 3 times and told he was greatly loved and strengthened by something that did not come from inside him. He had heard about Persian kings and Greek campaigns and the abomination that makes desolate and the resurrection of the dead and the wise shining like stars. He had heard all of it, and he did not understand. That is the condition in which the visions left him. Not satisfied. Not equipped with a complete map of the future that would allow him to explain everything to everyone who asked. Not comfortable. He was an old man who had seen enormous things and understood them only partially, and was being asked to hold what he had been given, without demanding more clarity than was being offered. What shall be the outcome of these things? The answer he received was not the answer he was looking for. Chapter 14. The Prayer in the Dark. In the first year of Darius the Mede, Daniel was reading. This is such a quiet detail that it is easy to move past it without stopping. The man who had interpreted dreams for kings and received visions of heavenly courtrooms and survived lions and outlasted 2 empires was sitting somewhere in Babylon reading a scroll, reading the words of the prophet Jeremiah. And in those words he found a number. Jeremiah had written that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. 70 years of exile. 70 years of the temple lying in ruins. 70 years of the people scattered. And then God would fulfill his good promise and bring them back. Daniel did the arithmetic. He had arrived in Babylon in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, somewhere around 605 before the Common Era. The temple had been destroyed in 587. Darius the Mede was now on the throne, which placed the date somewhere around 539. The 70 years Jeremiah had spoken of were nearly up. The exile was almost over. And Daniel prayed. What he did next is one of the most significant moments in his entire story. Though it does not involve a miraculous rescue or a heavenly vision or a king being confronted with uncomfortable truth, it involves an old man getting down on his knees in the dark and doing something that the whole first half of his story had been building toward, without the narrative ever quite naming it directly. He confessed, not his own sins primarily, the sins of his people, the accumulated failures of generations, the ways the community had broken covenant, the specific choices made across centuries that had contributed to the situation they were now in. He did not stand apart from it, did not position himself as the faithful remnant watching from a safe distance while he catalogued the failures of everyone else. He said we. He said our. He drew himself into the reckoning and stood there without flinching. O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and your rules. We have not listened to your servants the prophets who spoke in your name to our kings, our prince, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. He went through everything. The kings who had not listened, the prophets who had not been heard, the people who had turned aside. He did not organize the confession to highlight the failures of others while minimizing his own proximity to the community that had failed. He placed himself inside it, as one who shared the name and the history and the inheritance, as one for whom this was not an external problem but a family reckoning. To us belongs open shame, O Lord, to our kings, to our prince, and to our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him. Mercy and forgiveness belong to the Lord. Open shame belongs to us. That is not a comfortable theological position. It does not soften the diagnosis with mitigating circumstances, or explain the failures in terms of historical pressures that reduced the community's moral agency. It is blunt. It says what it says. We sinned. The consequences we are living with are connected to choices that were made. And the God we are appealing to is not being asked to overlook the reality of that connection, but to act out of a mercy that exists alongside the reality of it. And Daniel made the appeal. He said, Now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy, and for your own sake. O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. Because of your great mercy. This is the foundation the prayer is built on. Not Daniel's faithfulness across 50 years of service in a foreign empire. Not the food refusal or the dream interpretations or the prayer 3 times a day or the lion's den. Not any accumulated credit in the ledger of righteous acts. He had not earned this. He was not presenting his resume. He was presenting his need and the character of the God he was presenting it to. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not, for your own sake. O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name, for your own sake. There is a specific kind of prayer that makes its appeal not on the basis of what the one praying deserves, but on the basis of who God is and what God has committed himself to. Daniel had arrived at that kind of prayer, not as a theological argument designed to find the most effective rhetorical lever, but as the honest statement of a man who had spent 50 years watching the gap between what he deserved and what he had been given, and had no illusions about which side of that gap he stood on. He had been faithful. He had drawn his lines and held them. He had refused to bow when everyone else was bowing. He had done those things, but they were not what he was bringing to the prayer. He was bringing the ruins of Jerusalem and the desolation of the sanctuary and the scattered condition of a people who had been away from home for almost 70 years. And he was asking for mercy. While he was speaking, while the prayer was still coming out of him, Gabriel arrived. The same Gabriel who had interpreted the vision of the ram and the goat. The text says he came to Daniel in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. The phrase, the time of the evening sacrifice, is not incidental. The evening sacrifice had not been offered in Jerusalem for almost 70 years. The temple was in ruins. The altar was cold, but Daniel still measured time by it, still oriented his sense of the day by the rhythm of a worship that had been interrupted by the same exile. The prayer was asking to see ended. He had not forgotten what time it was in Jerusalem, even when he was nowhere near Jerusalem. Gabriel said, "O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved, greatly loved. At the beginning of your pleas, the moment Daniel opened his mouth, before the prayer was finished, before the words had fully formed, a word had already gone out. The prayer did not have to reach a certain threshold of quality or length or theological sophistication before it produced a response. It produced a response from its very first syllable. That is the kind of God Daniel had been praying toward 3 times a day for 50 years. The kind who hears before the sentence is complete. Gabriel brought a message about 70 weeks, a unit of 7, so that 77s were decreed over Daniel's people and his holy city. And Gabriel said what the 77s were for. And this is the part that matters most inside Daniel's story: to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. 6 things. 3 of them describe what will be ended or completed. 3 describe what will be brought in or established. What is ended? Transgression, sin, iniquity, the whole weight of accumulated human failure. The thing Daniel had just been confessing on behalf of his people. The thing that had produced the exile and the desolation and the 70 years of absence. Finished, atoned for, put to an end. What is brought in everlasting righteousness. Both vision and prophet sealed. A most holy place anointed. Daniel had asked for his city. He had asked for his people. He had asked for mercy. And the answer came back in a scale he had not asked for and could not fully comprehend. He had prayed about 70 years. Gabriel spoke to him about 77s. He had asked for the restoration of Jerusalem. The answer gestured towards something that would not just restore Jerusalem but address the root cause of why Jerusalem had needed restoring in the first place. He had asked for mercy on the basis of God's character rather than his own righteousness. The answer described a righteousness that would be everlasting precisely because it did not depend on the kind of righteousness that human beings generate and then fail to maintain across generations. Daniel received this and tried to hold it. What he had prayed and what he had received were the same in direction, but vastly different in scale. He had asked for rain and been told about the ocean. He had asked for a single act of restoration and been told about the healing of the thing underneath every failure of restoration that had ever happened. The most important prayers do that. They reach past the thing the one praying can articulate and pull toward something larger. Something that the one praying would not have known to ask for if they had been limited to what they already understood. Daniel's prayer in the dark reached that far, and what came back was larger than anything he had room for. He kept walking anyway. Chapter 15. Go your way until the end. The answer Daniel received was not the answer he was looking for. He had asked, "What shall be the outcome of these things?" He had asked it after receiving the longest and most detailed vision of his life. After being touched 3 times by a messenger who called him greatly loved. After hearing about Persian kings and Greek campaigns, and the abomination that makes desolate, and the resurrection of the dead, and the wise shining like stars. He had heard all of it and understood it only partially, and the partial understanding was not enough, and he was old and tired and had been fasting for 3 weeks, and he wanted to know how it ended. The man clothed in linen said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Go your way." 2 words that carry the full weight of what is being asked of Daniel in this final moment of his story. Not go and do something specific. Not go and tell what you have heard to the appropriate authorities. Just go. Keep moving. Continue in the direction you have been going. The path is still there and you are still on it, and the instruction is to keep walking. The words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. What Daniel had received was real. The visions were accurate. The interpretations Gabriel had given were true. But the full meaning of what had been shown would not become clear until the moment it was pointing toward arrived. It was sealed, locked, inaccessible to complete human understanding until the door opened from the other side. Daniel was not going to live to see that door open. He was being told, gently and directly, that understanding was not the gift being offered to him. The gift being offered was the instruction to keep going, to trust that what had been sealed would be opened in its time, and that his responsibility in the meantime was not to force the understanding, but to continue the faithfulness. The messenger said, "Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. But the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise shall understand. Those who are wise shall understand. Not immediately, not completely, but in the way that wisdom always understands. Not by decoding every detail, but by recognizing the shape of what is happening and continuing to move in the right direction, even when the destination is not fully visible. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. Numbers again. Specific numbers. Offered without complete explanation. Landing in the hands of a man who has just said he does not understand. Who is being given dates and durations for a calendar of suffering that he will not live to see completed. There is no way to sit with that honestly and not feel the weight of what it is asking. Daniel felt it. He had spent 3 weeks in fasting and mourning before the vision even began. He had been on his face in the dirt beside the Tigris before the first word was spoken. He had confessed that he had no strength and no breath. He had needed 3 touches just to stand up and say, "Let my Lord speak." And the answer to his final question was a number he would not live to reach. Then the final word came, "But go your way until the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." There it is. The last thing said to Daniel in the entire book that bears his name. Go your way until the end. You shall rest, and you shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Go your way until the end is not a triumphant send-off. It is not the language of a man being told he has finished well and can now enjoy the fruits of his faithfulness. It is something quieter and harder and in many ways more honest than that. It is the language of continuation. Keep going. The path does not end here. The end of your understanding is not the end of the path. Keep walking in the direction you have been walking. Until the end. There is something in that phrase that refuses to be softened. Until the end means there is still distance between here and there. It means the walking is not yet finished. It means that whatever Daniel was hoping might come, the resolution or the clarity or the sight of Jerusalem rebuilt or the understanding of what all the visions had been pointing toward, that was still ahead, still sealed, still not yet arrived. He was being sent back out into the same ordinary world he had been living in for 8 decades. Back to the administrative responsibilities. Back to the windows open toward Jerusalem 3 times a day. Back to the life of a man who knew more than he could say and had been given more than he could fully hold and was nonetheless required to keep going. Because that is what faithfulness looks like when it is not being propped up by resolution. You shall rest. The word the text uses carries the connotation of ceasing from labor, of setting down what has been carried, of arriving at the place where the effort is complete and the burden is no longer required. It is the word for what the dead do, and Daniel knew that. He was in his 80s. The rest being promised was not a nap. It was the end of the walking. He would rest, and then he would stand, in his allotted place, at the end of the days, his allotted place. The place that had been designated for him not by Nebuchadnezzar or Darius or Cyrus, but by the one who called him greatly loved. In the reckoning that did not operate on the same timeline as the empires Daniel had served, the same resurrection language the vision had used for the many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Daniel was being told that what had been promised for the many applied to him personally. The man who had refused the king's food as a teenager, who had opened his windows toward Jerusalem 3 times a day for 5 decades, who had interpreted dreams and read handwriting and survived lions and received visions he did not fully understand. That man would stand in his allotted place at the end of the days. Not the allotted place of his imperial career, not the administrative title or the position in the hierarchy of whatever empire happened to be running things when he died. His allotted place, the one that had been set aside for him in the reckoning that outlasted every empire he had ever served. He would stand there. Now let us sit with what these final words are actually doing. Daniel began as a teenager, carried through the Ishtar gate with a new name waiting for him on the other side. He ends as an old man beside a river, being told to go his way and rest and stand in his allotted place. The empire had named him Belteshazzar. The name had appeared in official documents for 70 years. The name had not taken. The person underneath proved more durable than the name the empire gave him. He was Daniel at the beginning. He was Daniel at the end. Daniel went his way. The text does not give us his death. It does not give us a final scene or a burial or a record of mourning. It gives us the instruction and then it stops. And the stopping is itself a kind of statement. The story ends not with Daniel's ending but with his continuing. Go your way. The continuing is the point. The story ends while he is still walking, because what his life proved, across 8 decades of sustained faithfulness in an environment that wanted everything from him, was not that the faithful always see the resolution. It was that the faithful keep walking even when they cannot see it. He went his way, and the walking was the answer all along. Babylon is gone. The city that Nebuchadnezzar built to announce the permanence of human power is rubble and desert in what is now Iraq, near a modern city called Hilla. Archaeologists have excavated it. Tourists visit it. The walls that were wide enough at the top for 2 chariots to pass each other going in opposite directions are dust. And the Ishtar Gate, the one Daniel walked through as a teenager with a new name waiting for him on the other side, was taken apart stone by stone and reconstructed in a museum in Berlin. 1 sentence. That is all that needs to be said about what happened to the empire that tried to own him. The Persian Empire that replaced it is gone. The Greek Empire that followed is gone. Every political arrangement that the visions of Daniel described and named and assigned its allotted time has run its allotted time and come to an end. The beasts rose from the sea and devoured and stamped and broke and then stood before the court and had their dominion stripped away. Exactly as the vision said they would. The book is still here. That is not a small thing. A document written in the ancient world, copied by hand across centuries. hidden in clay jars in desert caves when the people carrying it feared they would not survive to carry it further. Translated into hundreds of languages. Read every day in communities on every continent. Still generating arguments and sermons and dissertations and films and songs and late-night conversations between people who cannot agree on what the numbers mean but cannot set the text aside either. The community at Qumran. The group who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls in those caves above the desert before the Romans arrived, had copies of Daniel among their most carefully preserved documents. They were people living under an empire that wanted their complete loyalty and threatened death for refusal. They read Daniel the way people read maps when they are lost. Not for entertainment, but for orientation. For the assurance that the territory they were in had been traveled before and that someone had come out the other side. They hid the scrolls because they believed the words were worth more than their own survival. They were right. Jesus called himself the Son of Man. He used that phrase in contexts that his audience, formed in the synagogues and saturated in the prophets, would have recognized immediately as a reach back to the vision of Daniel chapter 7. The figure coming with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days and receiving an everlasting kingdom. He was not using it as a casual self-description. He was placing himself inside a specific vision that a specific old man had received beside the Tigris River centuries before. And he was saying, I am the one that vision was pointing toward. And in every generation since, in every community that has found itself inside Babylon, in one form or another, someone has reached for Daniel. The enslaved people in America who sang about the fiery furnace and the lion's den were not using those images decoratively. They were reading Daniel the way Daniel read Jeremiah, looking for the promise inside the description of a situation that looked like it had no exit. Finding in the specific words of a specific old man the assurance that empires are not the last word on anything. How do you live inside Babylon without becoming Babylon? That question has been needed in every century since Daniel was written down. It is being needed right now, by people in circumstances too varied to catalog. People who are inside systems that want more from them than they can give, without losing the thing that makes them who they are. People who are trying to figure out where the line is and how to hold it, and what the holding costs. Daniel's answer is not a policy. It is not a framework. It is not a 5-step program for maintaining your integrity in a corrupt environment. Daniel's answer is a life. A specific, costly, fully inhabited life. Lived across 8 decades in full exposure to an empire that could see everything he did and could not reach the thing that mattered most. He prayed with his windows open. He drew his lines quietly. He served with genuine excellence in roles he had not chosen and would not have chosen. He received what was given him and held what he could not yet open. He did not require the resolution to be visible before he continued walking toward it. And when the final instruction came, he went his way. The empire that tried to rename him is in a museum in Berlin. Daniel is still Daniel, still being read, still being needed, still true.